Thank you for joining us today for the webinar on transitioning transportation to net zero emissions, a case study for heavy-duty road freight in Alberta. My name is Carolina Calderon, and I'm the Director of Policy and External Relations for Prairies Economic Development Canada, or PrairiesCan for short. That's what we're known as. And for those of you who don't know us, PrairiesCan is the on-the-ground presence through the Federal Regional Development Agency. We are headquartered here in Edmonton, and we provide a place-based perspective to Ottawa that helps to highlight the economic growth opportunities and the innovation that's taking place across the prairies. We have been an early supporter of the hydrogen ecosystem in Alberta, and in particular through our partnership with the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux nations. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our communities. And we encourage you to reflect on the traditional territory that you find yourselves on as well. So this webinar is part of a series of the Edmonton Hydrogen Hub's webinar series, building a low carbon hydrogen economy in the Edmonton region. These are monthly conversations, and they're meant to provide a variety of stakeholders the knowledge and tools needed to take advantage of the opportunity here in Edmonton, but also to contribute to the development of this new energy system. You are welcome to see past webinars on the Edmonton Hydrogen Hub website, erh2.ca, and this presentation will be available there and on YouTube tomorrow. So turning to today's topic, transitioning transportation to net zero emissions. In Canada, the combustion of transportation fuels, including gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and fuel oil, accounts for approximately 28% of our greenhouse gas emissions. To meet our net zero commitments, these fuels, and likely the vehicles they serve, will need to be replaced with zero-emission energy carriers and vehicles. This has significant implications for oil-producing Alberta. We're joined today by the University of Calgary's Dr. David Layzell, Dr. Alex de Barros, and Zach Redick. They'll be providing a high-level assessment of the net zero solutions for Canada's transportation sector, with a specific case study on Alberta's heavy-duty road freight sector. So it is my pleasure to introduce each of them. Dr. David Layzell is an energy systems architect with the Transition Accelerator, a faculty professor at the University of Calgary, and director of the Canadian Energy Systems Analysis Research Initiative. Between 2008 and 2012, he was executive director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy, Environment, and Economy at the University of Calgary. And before moving to Calgary, he was professor of biology at Queen's University with cross appointments in environmental studies and the School of Public Policy. While at Queen's, Dr. Layzell co-founded a scientific instrumentation company called Quibbit Systems, Inc., and was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada for his research contributions. Dr. Alex de Barros has worked extensively in transportation engineering consulting firms. He is the former director of airport infrastructure of the Brazilian National Civil Aviation Agency, where he was responsible for regulation and oversight of airport standards, operations, and safety. His academic record in the fields of transportation engineering includes several research projects and publications on aviation, airports, transportation planning, and safety issues. He has modeled transportation systems in academia and in industry, including road, rail, seaport, and airport systems. Zachary Redick completed his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering with a minor in Transportation Engineering in 2020. He is currently a master's student at the University of Calgary. He is working to obtain his Master of Science in Civil Engineering, specializing in transportation engineering under the supervision of Dr. Barros and Dr. Layzell. So throughout this presentation, we ask you to place your questions into the Q&A box and not the chat box. Please leave the chat box for our introductions and to see where you're from, but questions specifically in the Q&A box. And if you really like someone's question, feel free to upvote it. This will help us determine the order in which the questions will be asked. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the presenters, please.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for the wonderful introduction. I will share my screen, and if I don't hear anything, I'll assume that everything is working properly. Okay. Thank you, everybody, so much. My name is Zachary Redick, and I'm going to be presenting the first part of this presentation, of which is Transitioning Transportation to Net Zero Emissions, a case study for heavy-duty road freight within Alberta. Now, over the past 25 years, there's been a large focus on incremental climate change through things like the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Accord. Recently, with the signing of the Paris Agreement, there has been a much larger focus on transformative change, looking at not just improving our industry, but transforming it over time to meet a true net zero future. Now, in 2019, Canada emitted about 724 megatons of CO2 equivalent, of which heavy-duty trucks were responsible for about 38 megatons. Now, the heavy-duty trucking sector is a difficult-to-abate sector, as vehicles are seen as an investment meant to last for years. This means that a transformational change is required from using diesel with internal combustion engines to using zero-emission energy carriers such as electricity and/or hydrogen and new vehicle technologies. Now, the Canadian government has set targets for the sale of new zero-emission vehicles. The targets that they have set are trying to achieve 35% zero-emission sales by 2030 and near 100% by 2040. And I think my camera is ever so slightly fuzzy. We'll just try to restart that to get it a little bit clearer. There we go. Now, taking a look at the vehicle landscape for medium-duty and heavy-duty vehicles within 2019, we can see that heavy-duty vehicles make up only about 20% of the vehicle sales for 2019 and about 22% of the registered vehicle numbers. However, despite having only a small population of sales and registered vehicles compared to medium-duty, they do make up more than 50% of the vehicle kilometers traveled between the two groups of trucks and 62% of the fuel use. This means that overall, in terms of transitioning, the average heavy-duty vehicle will have about a 6 to 10 times climate benefit of transitioning over medium-duty vehicles, further proving the benefit of transitioning the heavy-duty sector. So now, as the title suggests, new value chains will of course be needed to support this transition. While the trucks themselves are of course important, they are a part of a much larger value chain for this transition to net zero. Starting off, zero-emission carrier production is needed, both for low greenhouse gas production of power and low greenhouse gas production of hydrogen. As well, transporting these fuels from production to end use creates a major challenge, but if done in an efficient manner, can of course very much help strengthen this value chain. And of course, creation of batteries and fuel cells are also dependent on OEMs, which along with the other parts of the value chain, lead us to the key stakeholders, which of course are the buyers, leasers, and end users of these heavy-duty trucks. Now, each part of this value chain is very important, and ensuring proper communication and cooperation throughout will lead to a much more efficient transition. So I'll just take you quickly through the outline for this presentation. I'll start off by taking us through the heavy-duty trucking sector within Alberta, how that looks. I'll take you through the results of the heavy-duty truck transition model that we've been producing for the past few years. Then Dr. Layzell will take over, looking at the estimating of the incremental cost of the transition, finding the resources to support this transition, and then looking into the conclusions. So what do we know about heavy-duty trucks within Alberta? Well, we know that heavy-duty trucks in Alberta range in size from about 15 to 63.5 ton gross vehicle weight, with those 63.5 ton vehicle weight trucks being those kind of multi-unit B trains. We know that for the past 5 years, there's been on average about 6,100 new heavy-duty trucks sold in Alberta. And in 2019, there was 111,415 trucks registered. Now, these trucks from government sources are driving on average about 95,633 vehicle kilometers traveled per vehicle per year. And as seen from government data and the vehicle surveys, vehicles do decline in the amount of kilometers they are driving as they get older. Within the first few years of age, they are driving about 170, 180% of the average VKT, and then declining to only about 20 to 25%. So knowing the registered and average vehicle kilometers traveled, we know that for Alberta within 2019, the total kilometers traveled was about 10.7 billion VKT. Now, for the heavy-duty trucking population, we know that they can be separated into two distinct groups, short-haul and long-haul trucks. The short-haul trucks are usually much shorter range, drive within the city, and are returned to base at the end of the day. And these include things like fire trucks, cement mixers, dump trucks, and refrigerated vans. Now, these provide a good opportunity for battery electric as a transition option due to their shorter range and ability to return to base at the end of day. However, for much longer haul vehicles such as semi-sleepers, heavy semi-tractors, and of course those B trains, they need to be driving sometimes over 1,000 kilometers per trip. They require rapid refueling and usually are not returned to base at the end of the day. Unfortunately, BEV technology cannot support these requirements at this time. And because of this, hydrogen within fuel cell electric vehicles has become the zero-emission vehicle of choice for these long-haul vehicles. Now, we do know that many of the heavy-duty vehicles that are purchased for long haul, they are then used for 3 to 5 years and then are sold into the short haul market, which we do take into account, of which the reverse does not occur. Now let's start looking into our heavy-duty vehicle model. We started off by looking at a business as usual scenario based on historical government data for Alberta. We used past and future sale projections to then calculate a business as usual scenario for registrations, vehicle kilometers traveled, and further things like fuel demand and vehicle costs, which we'll look at later. And then we took that business as usual scenario and modified it to create our two scenarios that we're going to be looking at throughout this presentation. The first one being our 35% 2030 scenario, which meets both Canada's targets for 2030, meeting 35%, and 2040, meeting near 100%, about 95%. And two, meeting just the 95% 2040 scenario and ignoring that original 35% by 2030 scenario. So technological transitions typically follow S-curves and can be seen within the deployment of innovations within the last 100 years. Things from smartphones to cameras to even color TVs all start off with low adoption initially, then rapid growth, and then level off as they reach about 100% market share. Now, the same S-curve transitions can be seen within the modeling of our two heavy-duty trucking scenarios as well. However, what you may notice is that the required rate of ZEV market share growth for both scenarios in order to meet government targets is high, especially for that initial 2030 35% target, requiring a similar adoption seen within things like smartphones and digital cameras. Now, the two scenarios that we are going to be modeling represent both the minimum market share that will be required to meet that later target of 2040, 95%, and that stretch goal of wanting to meet the 35% by 2030. But the reality will not just be one or the other of these two scenarios. These two scenarios provide the upper and lower bounds of what is going to be needed, where the reality will most likely be somewhere in between these two scenarios. So let's start taking a look into the modeling of both of these scenarios. We have on the left-hand side our high scenario of meeting initially that 35% target and overachieving by the time we meet 2040 by about 99.7%. And our lower 95% 2040 scenario, of which we're just meeting that 95% by 2040, and within this scenario, only meeting about 12% of sales by 2030. Now, of course, the next 10 years in this transition will be critical, as even within next year, we are looking at, in order to meet both of these government targets, having to sell at least between 39 and 77 new fuel cell electric vehicles just within the next year. And if any of you are familiar with the 5,000 truck challenge, in order to meet 5,000 new sales of fuel cell electric vehicles, within our higher scenario on the left, we will be meeting that target by about 2030. And within our lower scenario on the right-hand side, we'll be meeting that by about 2033. So of course, taking these modeling of sales into registrations, within our higher 35% scenario target, we will be meeting 5% by 2030. Almost 50% of the registered vehicle population will be zero emission by 2040 and reaching about 87% by 2050. Now, on the opposite end, because this scenario is lagging behind, trying to just meet that 95% target, we will be seeing much lower registration numbers, like 34% by 2040, rather than 49 by the other scenario, and only about 77 versus 87%. However, since those aging internal combustion engine vehicles are expected to be using much less fuel and be driving much less kilometers as they age, zero-emission vehicles are projected to account for a much higher percentage of the VKT, which for both our high scenario and our low scenario, despite only being about 87% and 70% of the registered vehicles by 2050, we are looking at, for the high scenario, about 97% of the VKT being attributed to zero-emission vehicles by 2050, and despite being about 10% lower registrations, only about 4% less for VKT at about 93% for the lower scenario as well, which are quite high for both scenarios. Moving on into life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, we of course are going to be assuming that we are reaching 35% net zero by 2035 for the electrical grid, and we are going to be assuming that we're going to be achieving much lower greenhouse gases for the production of blue hydrogen going towards 2050. But with both of those assumptions aside, we are looking at about 68 to 50% greenhouse gas reduction by 2040, with around 87 to 90% reduction by 2050, which is a much greater improvement. And of course, it is not 100% net zero, but in terms of having vehicles as an investment, this is a very large improvement. And in order to get us just to that last 10%, last 13%, some other negative emission technologies can be achieved to ensure that we do meet true net zero. Now, of course, we've looked at sales, registrations, VKT. Now let's start looking at what this means in terms of the hydrogen demand and electricity demand as well for these heavy-duty trucks. By the time we meet 2050, for both scenarios, we are looking at about 2,800 to about 3,000 tons of hydrogen per day. Now, this is about 50% of the current hydrogen production that we produce today in Alberta, where it is mostly used within industrial feedstocks, and an increase of about 1.4 terawatt hours per year, which is a slight increase of only about 2.4% in terms of Alberta's public grid. Now, of course, as we've talked about previously, the next 12 years, next 10 years are critical. By 2035, we are expecting to need about 500 to 1,000 tons of hydrogen being produced per day. And by 2035 for electricity, about 240 to 470 gigawatt hours per year on top of the current grid. So ensuring that we have the hydrogen production to meet this, of course, is going to be yet another challenge within the entire value chain that we are looking at. So going to lastly, the incremental costs of ZEVs. We've taken multiple values from literature and averaged them to create a decline curve, both for the price of fuel cell electric vehicles and battery electric vehicles, where we are assuming that we're going to meet cost parity for these vehicles to diesel ICEs by about 2035. Now, Alberta heavy-duty vehicle sector pays already about $1.4 billion per year for new vehicles. Now, this is basically the average expected cost for vehicles going forward. And on top of the expected internal combustion diesel vehicle pricing, these new vehicles will have an incremental cost on top of that. Now, this incremental cost, of course, ranges from about 702 million to about 1.7 billion between the two scenarios. Now, of course, there is a large discrepancy between these two numbers, and the reason for this is mainly due to the fact that our 95% 2040 scenario has shifted the production of these vehicles forward into the future, which, as these prices do decline over time, this results in a much cheaper scenario within our 95% scenario. And of course, these lower projected costs may not truly be realized since, of course, sales are needed to reduce these costs and prices due to more vehicles being produced reduces the cost. So this greater reduction in cost over this scenario may not truly be seen because we are pushing these sales forward. Now, to engage the truck owner and operators in the transition, governments will need to cover the additional cost of ZEVs until cost parity is achieved, or until the transition is well underway. And from here, I will transition the presentation onto Dr. Layzell, who will take us into the second half.
Thank you very much, Zach. Thank you for presenting that, and I will pick up where you left off, and we'll carry on. What I'd like to do is to step back and let's look at some of what are the other areas where incremental cost will be faced by the industry in this sector, and what do we need to do? What are the estimates of those costs? We've already heard from Zach's work about zero-emission vehicles and the fact that they're really small production, so there's a higher cost now, but they're expected to reach cost parity. And the government really needs to come in and look at helping to cover the incremental costs for both fuel cell and the battery electric vehicles. There's also, of course, this problem of our refueling stations. The existing diesel fueling stations that are distributed across Canada supporting the heavy truck sector aren't going to be work for hydrogen or for electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles. So there's new risk. This is a new technology. There's risk in actually deploying these stations. They got small production numbers. The costs are very high, much higher than a diesel vehicle. And so what we're estimating or suggesting might be needed is about 50% of the CapEx cost to 2030 for building these stations, and then maybe a declining contribution to CapEx to zero essentially by 2040. So to see what that might look like, here's an analysis on hydrogen fueling station estimates of what might be required. We're looking here from using Zach's model to how much hydrogen we need and how many vehicles have to be delivered, and making some assumptions about the size of the fueling stations that need to be built. And this is in the black line here, and going on the right side of this chart. We're looking at this fueling station starting around 4 tons a day and then moving up to about 15 tons a day by 2050, gradually. And this would require the number of fueling stations as shown on the left chart here, rising from in a few dozen or so fueling stations back in 2025 to about 240, 250 fueling stations by 2050. And this is the two scenario models. This is the 35% 2030 scenario where we meet the 35% market share by 2030. And the fueling station numbers here are for the slower scenario where we only really target the meeting the 2040 target of 95%. So if we estimate a subsidy, and it's, if we're building a fueling stations, it's about $20 million to put together a 10-ton-a-day fueling station. So we've set here, just as a first approximation, about a $10 million per station Canadian dollar price through to 2030 and then declining to 2040. And when you actually compile this to the number of stations that have to be built each year, we're talking about a rise in cost to something over $150 million a year by the early 2030s and then declining over the 2040s. And this is the 35% 2030 scenario, the fast growth scenario, and the slower growth scenarios is this should say 95 2040, sorry about that, rising here and then coming down to meet the 2040 to be zero at 2040. There's also the issue, so we've talked about zero emission vehicles, we talked about refueling, recharging stations. We also have a challenge of producing low carbon hydrogen, liquefying it and transporting it to where it's going to be needed, so essentially connecting the low cost supply of hydrogen to where the stations need to be located. And getting the price down to this on this area so it gets down close to parity with diesel is a challenge. It's especially a challenge in the first early years when we don't have the infrastructure in place and the demand. So one has less efficient use of resources. And there are some programs in place to already help with this, certainly on the low carbon hydrogen production with carbon capture and storage initiatives, et cetera. But there's going to be other investments needed. And so for this scenario and simulations, we've said $1 a kilogram of hydrogen produced subsidy through to 2030 and then declining to zero by 2040. On the low carbon power generation side, we're looking at other programs. We're not talking about a massive increase in the size of the public grid, and there are other initiatives to try to drive to a zero carbon grid. So we're looking to other programs to cover that aspect. We can also look at the issue we've talked about previously, which is training. We need to train drivers and technicians and first responders to basically be able to use these vehicles, to know how to respond when there's an accident involving a battery electric or hydrogen vehicle, and also to be training the technicians to maintain and keep these vehicles running. We see this as program funding. We put this in this scenario up to $20 million per year required for the province over the time. So putting all of those numbers together, we get the results here for the two scenarios that Zach had talked about and has done the initial work on, and looking at fuel cell vehicles and battery electric vehicles. This is the work that you've seen before from Zach with the fuel cell vehicles and battery electric, the price, the Canadian dollars, millions of dollars per year required to help in the transition. On top of that, we're looking at hydrogen fueling station costs and electric carbon charging stations, so electric charging stations for electric vehicles, for the battery electric vehicles. The hydrogen supplement, the cost needed to that $1 a kilogram up to 2030 and then declining as hydrogen demand rises very rapidly over this period. And of course, training cost at the end. In total, we're looking at over the period from 2025 to 2040, when we think this transition period should occur, we're looking here at about $4.8 billion as the incremental cost. That's in the fast scenario. In the slower scenario, where we're looking at only achieving the 95% target by 2040, the costs are quite a bit reduced. Again, we still have the same need for all the same sorts of subsidies, but we estimate the total cost there is around $2.2 billion. So one would ask a question. This is a lot of money. This is not an insignificant. So why should government invest this magnitude of resources? And so I'd like to propose two reasons of why this is important to consider and for the government to move forward on. First of all, we've got to understand that the industry will be committing much more to this transition. And so this is only supplementing what is going on, a very major investments by industry. Some of the work that's been done, we've done earlier, as well as in other groups around North America have done, is an estimate, and this is probably a very conservative estimate, of the total cost of ownership to put a truck on the road and run it is about $2 per kilometer. And this includes labor cost and fuel costs, maintenance, the depreciation of the asset, so essentially the cost of the vehicle, the insurance cost, and the administration. So overall, about $2 per kilometer traveled. And given that these vehicles are, as these fuel cell vehicles and battery electric vehicles get deployed and start running between 2025 and 2040, these zero emission vehicles are expected to travel about 62 billion kilometers within Alberta. That would be at $2 a kilometer, $123 billion will be spent by the industry to actually get these vehicles and use them on the road. So we're at a subsidy of 4.8 billion. We're only looking at 4% of what the industry is already going to be spending. When we do that same analysis over here on the slow transition, we're looking at, achieving the 95% by 2040. The vehicles won't be as many vehicles on the road by then. They'll be traveling about 37 billion kilometers. And so the industry will have spent about $74 billion over that period in actually in keeping the vehicles on the road and using them. So a subsidy of $2.2 billion in this case is only about a 3% subsidy of the overall cost. So it seems this is compared to other government investments in helping industry. I need to think of battery plants or hydrogen production. Given this level of industrial investment, these are the 4.8 billion, or especially 2.2 billion is a relatively small resource investment. And the second issue is that the sector will have actually paid a lot more than this in carbon taxes over that period. So again, analysis here, as we know that the carbon tax is payable on the diesel fuel that's being used in heavy duty vehicles. And the carbon tax is about 2025, we're looking at about $95, oops, I'm sorry here. We're 80, 90, maybe it's $105 a ton by by 2025, rising to $170 a ton. And then we've just left it at $170 a ton after 2030. If it was business as usual scenario where we're just leaving it on diesel, over this period we've done this model from 2023 to 2040, the business as usual would have paid a carbon tax of about $27 billion. In the 95-2040 scenario shown in the green line here, this one is about where they would have paid about $22 billion over this period. And in the 2030, where we're really looking at a much rapid leaving of diesel and transitioning to hydrogen vehicles, we're looking at about a $19 billion of fuel tax would have been paid. So in other words, to pay for the incremental cost of the heavy duty vehicle transition, and we're not talking about all the costs, not cost of the vehicles, the fueling station, some hydrogen supply, some training and support, etc. We're talking about perhaps needing about 25% of the carbon taxes paid on diesel fuel used in the 2035 and the 35% 2030 scenario. And when we go to the 95% 2040 scenario, we're really only looking at a 9 or 10% of the carbon taxes paid. So our main conclusion here is that not only is the industry putting a lot of funding in, and 4.8 billion or 2.2 billion is a relatively small percentage of that. The sector is actually contributing through carbon taxes sufficient money to cover that and still leave the funding to go to other aspects or other investments, even back to Canadian taxpayers. So in conclusion, I think we can conclude three things. One is this: our cost estimates here are preliminary. And we would argue that a much deeper analysis is required with extensive industry consultation, but following sort of a similar approach and to really get a good idea of what the real costs will be. And not we're trying to guess that from what's in the literature and what our analysis is and from informal discussions. But certainly this needs to be done. We're critical. It's very important in the strategy to actually achieve net zero aspects. However, I think our analysis, are within a range, sort of an order of magnitude, that it's pretty clear that current government programs and investments will not get the heavy duty vehicle sector on a transition pathway to net zero. We do need a strategy that aligns programs and resources with the scale of the challenge and the opportunity in this sector. And I think that's probably our major conclusion. We'd also like to conclude that the truck transition model that Zach's been developing in his graduate program has a lot of power. It could be deployed using data from other regions and sectors in Canada, and even actually looking, for example, at the medium heavy duty trucks or the medium duty trucks in Canada and other sectors and provinces across Canada. Thank you very much. I'm happy to enter in discussion, I'm still with Zach and Alex. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the presenters. That was excellent. For myself, from a federal perspective, really interesting to see that public funding component. So I'll start us off. I see that we've already got some really good questions in the Q&A. Again, I would encourage folks to take a look at the Q&A, the questions that have been added in the box. And if you're interested in upvoting some of them, please do, and that'll determine the order in which we can ask these. But I'll start off. You know, you both mentioned that the next 10 to 12 years are critical. And then couple that with the point you made, David, that Dr. Layzell, pardon, that what's currently available in terms of government programming is not going to hit the mark, and there's a strategy. So I guess my question, I know it's a bit broad, it's not technical, but it is what is critical in the next, you know, five years, that if you could kind of talk about some of the elements of that strategy that's needed to move on urgently, what would those be?
Well, I think we need to be focusing on corridors because that's where the heavy trucks run and they use the most kilometers. And we need to be focused on the sectors and the industries that can use the kinds of hydrogen vehicles and battery electric vehicles that are being produced today. Let's be honest, a lot of the vehicles we need, the 63.5 ton hydrogen trucks, don't yet exist in the market today. You know, we're hoping to see the first two in the world come on the roads of Edmonton in October this year with the AZTEC project, but they're not going to be commercial trucks, they're going to be pilots. So we've got a challenge of aligning getting the companies engaged that can deal with, say, 40 ton trucks, maybe not 63 ton gross vehicle weight trucks, but are using them on relatively long haul. I would say the Calgary Edmonton corridor is ideal, but there's other major corridors. We need to get the fueling stations in place. You're not going to convince people to test these trucks out. We need to get the level of subsidy needed in order to put a truck on the road in the next few years is so much. It's a lot more than what the government resources have available. We're talking a few $100,000, more than 200,000, probably closer to $400,000 per truck is needed in the next few years to get these trucks demonstrated and trialed and to get the sales up. But we also need the fueling stations, and we need a hydrogen supply of low carbon hydrogen. All of this has to be coordinated. And I think these the programs to do this now in the federal government and in provincial governments are all different programs with different funding mechanisms, different applications. I would argue that's that's important. So to get ourselves organized in the next few years, well, I would argue we need to really be thinking about a long-term plan. But maybe Zach, I'll throw it to you, and I mean, what you see is, from your models in terms of as really needing to be focused on.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with almost everything you've said, but it is a challenge because even from the modeling numbers that I was talking about within my part of the presentation, we are going to be needing to meet the government targets, almost 30 to 70 new fuel cell electric vehicles being sold by next year, which may not even be achievable. It feels almost as if we are already behind on trying to meet both the 2030 and the 2040 targets. And so just trying to kind of bring together everybody from the value chain, trying to make conversations with government to talk about how we are going to make sure, because if they want us to meet these targets, we are going to need cooperation from the value chain and cooperation from the government as well, in order to coordinate both investment from government and investment from just all over the industry to ensure that this happens. Because if we don't if we don't get the ball rolling, we're already going to be behind on meeting these targets, and then things will be much more difficult going into the future.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I'm in the question and answer box right now, so I'll start with the first one that's got 4 votes here. So, how shall we gather, transmit, store, distribute the very large amounts of clean hydrogen that we will need? And clean has the parentheses there, the quote marks. Repurpose extant steel natural gas pipelines, and how to do so safely, profitably, and for the long term. So who'd like to take a stab at that one?
think I might put that over to Dr. Layzell, because I think he has a little bit more experience in terms of pipelines and such.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think part of the issue is if we're looking at hydrogen, primary application for hydrogen, role for hydrogen is in the heavy duty trucking sector. I think in the next 10 years, it's probably going to be moved not as gaseous hydrogen, but as liquid hydrogen. Just look at the old economics of the fueling station, the economics of what's needed for the trucks, the compression that's needed, or you can get from warming up, if you like, liquid hydrogen. I think the overall economics make sense that it's probably going to be the liquid hydrogen, not moving in natural gas pipelines. However, in the longer term, and when you look at the entire transition of all the economy, not just the heavy trucking sector, but space heating and industry, we are going to need a lot of hydrogen, even more hydrogen. And we've talked about the 3,000 tons a day by 2050. We need a lot more than that to serve other industry, other sectors in the economy. And in that case, we are going to need to get into pipelines. And if we could repurpose natural gas pipelines, that would be fantastic. We need the technology to make sure we can do that safely, or we need to put in some new pipelines. And I think that, the issue is, I guess one of the questions in a strategy for a federal strategy and provincial strategy is to figure out what's the role of hydrogen within a net zero energy future. What role does it, certainly what role it has in heavy duty trucking, but what about a medium duty trucking? What about in cars, and what about trains? I think there's Maggie has a question about trains and airplanes and back off-road vehicles. What its role in space heating and industrial heat and power? I believe there's a role for hydrogen in many of these sectors, more in some than in others, but together they're going to create a demand for hydrogen at a provincial level of not a few thousand tons a day, but maybe 10, 15 or 1,000 tons a day of hydrogen, in which case now we're talking about needing infrastructure. And that discussion has to start right away. That discussion needs to go on. It's a much bigger discussion than just heavy duty vehicles. It's saying, what's our plan? What does net zero 2050 look like? And I think we're going to find out that that the infrastructure we're going to need to put in for other sectors could really help transition the heavy duty trucking sector. But I think the scope of Zach's thesis is on, let's look at the heavy duty trucking sector. We don't want to dump everything on him and solve the problems of the world. So his thesis is really on, if the heavy duty trucking sector is on its own, how are we going to do it? And I think then we're probably looking at liquid hydrogen.
And that really also kind of goes into the idea of, while heavy duty trucking might be an incremental change, we are really looking towards a transformative change of the industry. Hydrogen for heavy duty trucks is just one very small part of the overall story of how the hydrogen transition is going to happen. And so while trying to get the storage and transportation of hydrogen through pipelines will be very beneficial for trucking, it is a very much larger kind of aspect in terms of every other industry that needs hydrogen and is transitioning as well.
Well, thank you for that. We've got a question from Ian here. Absent a requirement that hydrogen be very low carbon, what is the plan to ensure that low carbon hydrogen would be used in a zero emission capable heavy duty vehicle?
I think we've got to, if you want to get subsidies and government subsidies for not only for vehicles, but for fueling stations, for hydrogen supply, I think that the expectation and the requirement is you've got to demonstrate that your hydrogen meets a low CI standard. We need to find what that standard is. We're recommending within the Transition Accelerator and the work we've been doing that, we can have a fairly loose standard initially in the next few years, but every year it should be tightened year by year. So, and that needs to be told to the producers of the hydrogen that, they've got to meet this standard in order to able to sell their hydrogen into this sector. And I think that's the only way we're gonna be able to achieve the transition we need. So I think it's a great question, but I think we do need to have it. Now, there's other ways to make hydrogen than from blue hydrogen, from electrolysis, green hydrogen. There's you can make it through methane pyrolysis, which is another question now later about distributed hydrogen production at fueling stations. Very exciting technologies there. And you can even make it from biomass gasification and then capturing the CO2. So one could actually create negative emission hydrogen, where your hydrogen actually, you use the hydrogen and you're actually getting a net removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And I think that's, if we actually credited that carbon emissions removal at, up to $170 a ton, I think you would find you could make very cost competitive hydrogen from biomass gasification, so as a biofuel, which I think there's a lot of different technologies that could come to bear to help us solve this problem. Strong government direction, strong vision and government direction would really help to stimulate the industries and the industrial investment to go along with it.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And that question about what technologies need to be scaled up quickly is also something to really consider for government and for others. But I'm turning to Maggie's question here. You mentioned it, Dr. Layzell. So the question is, have estimations been made for using hydrogen in trains?
Certainly, we haven't done the full analysis. Train turnover is a little interesting. Trains, when I talk to the train companies, the locomotives, the CP Rail, CN Rail, they tend to keep their trains for a very long time. They're 50 years old, and they just replace the engines in them, right? The beauty of it, most of the trains and locomotives today are electric trains. They're diesel electric, right? So taking the diesel engine out, and as CP Rail has done, and they're in the process of building 3 such trains now. There are locomotives that they've taken the diesel engine out and putting fuel cells in with hydrogen tanks on them. And I think that's a very promising technology. If that can get to be demonstrated, we're going to need to make sure we have fuel supply to help the trains. The beauty of it, trains are a great way to move heavy things, and the train lines could actually be a kind of a pipeline on wheels initially and our train lines happen to follow many of our major highways. So I think there's a possibility of synergies between the transitioning the train sector to hydrogen and also using the train sector to actually move hydrogen fuel around to actually serve the trucking sector. I think there's some, and maybe a few other sectors as well. It's difficult to see. I think if we're going to serve the heating sector, or industry as where we're burning hydrogen as a fuel with low carbon emissions, we need pipelines. There's no way we're going to be trucking it or training it around. We just can't afford the cost to do that. We need pipelines.
We've got another question here from Ian that's got a couple of votes behind it. Has the industrial demand for low carbon hydrogen been modeled under tier? So for chemicals and fertilizer production and so forth, has it been modeled under tier or other, and assessed how transporting hydrogen users will develop hydrogen capacity that can compete with industrial demand? So I think that question of using it for industrial demand, particularly in an Alberta setting.
I'm not sure that so I'm not exactly sure how to answer Ian's question. I would say that when you look at the carbon intensity, when you look at what Air Products has planned, and even what Suncor and ATCO have announced in their large production, where they're talking about hundreds of tons a day of hydrogen being made with autothermal reforming. Our analysis at the actual, it's well under 1 ton of CO2 per ton of hydrogen could be produced with their process. Now, you still got to deal with the upstream emissions of natural gas, of methane, for example, from natural gas recovery, and of CO2 that's released to the atmosphere often when you're upgrading natural gas recovered into pipeline quality. My sense is that we need our regulators and government regulators to follow through on their commitments to massively reduce methane emissions from upstream processes, and to also start to put economic incentives in place, or disincentives in place, if you like, to capture that CO2 and sequester it, like to the CO2 and prevent methane release. only by doing that can we actually achieve the kind of net zero, this transition to net zero. And I think so those standards, those are standards that will probably be put in, my hope is put in, for use of hydrogen as industrial feedstock. And I guess what I'm looking at is using hydrogen. It's the same hydrogen would work in a transportation fuel sector, or indeed for home heating and others, and putting that to see the industrial feedstock production kind of be an anchor tenant on the production of low carbon hydrogen, and provide the sort of the highest quality standard, the lowest carbon emissions possible. It's going to actually reflect well in the carbon intensity of our fossil fuel products we export from this province, and our carbon intensity of motor production, for example. But it will also create an incredible feedstock that will help to transition the freight sector.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew's got a question about how does your analysis change if Alberta does not hit net zero by 2035? And has the electricity demand for hydrogen electrolysis been factored into the analysis?
Two good questions. I mean, the second scenario that Zach presented, right, was one where we don't meet 2035, but we said we got to meet 2040. And so it's actually, I think, a more achievable something. Meeting 2035 is extremely challenging, just because the vehicles don't exist yet. I mean, the industry is not ready with the vehicles. We don't have the fueling stations ready. We're behind. We should have been doing this 3 or 4 years ago and getting ready for it, but we're, and each year we're closer and closer to that 2030 date, and it becomes more and more challenging. I think if we started moving extremely fast right now, we might be able to meet the 2040 target, right? And we're only going to get 12%, as Zach said, of sales in 2030, or as low as 12%. But that still would put us on a track that that's going to take a lot of investment and a real coordinated approach. In terms of, we could miss the 2040 target, let's be honest. We're on the track to do that right now. And I worry about climate impacts, and I worry about our industry being behind other sectors. The Americans are moving faster than us now, and in this area, and I worry about us falling behind, not only from an environmental context, but in terms of economic development context. But I'm not sure that quite answered. I don't see that question, but I was, the electrolysis one was the other one.
Right.
We certainly have looked at electrolysis. The challenge is that in Alberta, especially where we have a large capability for CCS, we have low cost natural gas. The electrolysis is about if we had enough green electricity, low carbon electricity, wind or solar to make hydrogen, it's going to be about 3 times the price of hydrogen. Now, I think there is a role for electrolytic hydrogen in Alberta, especially if you got spare, electricity that is not needed on the grid. You're making more electricity than what the grid demands, and that'd be a great way to get some value out of that electricity. But you could also look at putting electrolysis at fueling stations that are really remote. It's going to cost a lot, and especially smaller fueling stations. That that what you would cost you to transport and maintain a fueling station where you're bringing in hundreds of kilometers and small amounts of hydrogen, you might find that you can pay 3 times the price for the hydrogen and still get an economically viable fueling station that is run by, say, a local wind farm or a wind and solar resource. And I think a lot more work needs to be done on that, and we need to put policies in place to encourage those kinds of developments as well. Across Canada, I think in other provinces, sometimes electrolytic hydrogen is probably going to be more economic.
Well, I cannot believe we're almost at time. It has gone by quick, and we have a number of questions that we were not able to get to. So my apologies for that, the group, but we really value the engagement of all the participants today. And I would just like to say thank you to the panelists. I feel like you've done such a great job of outlining your insights and defining reality for us, right? In terms of these are scenarios and these are the issues and the sense of urgency that's required by a number of different players to get this new energy system moving. So with that, I believe we're done. I'll mention again that this is being recorded and it's going to be available on the website and YouTube as of tomorrow. And the next Edmonton Hydrogen Hub event will happen in person. It's going to be presented by Diesel Tech Industries. So thank you for that. And it's going to be a hops and hydrogen networking event. So stay tuned to hear more about that. But thank you again to everyone who took the time today and to the presenters.